Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking. I'm Ben Bland, the director of the Asia Pacific programme at Chatham House. I'm filling in for Bronwen Maddox, who's in Nigeria. In this week's episode, we're asking, how does China see Trump's foreign policy? To answer that, I'm delighted to be joined by three Chatham House experts on China's diplomacy, security and economics. William Matthews is a security expert and a senior research fellow, and David Lubin is an economist and senior research fellow in our Global Economy and Finance programme. First up, I'm joined by Yu Jie, who's a senior research fellow on China. Yu Jie, you're a regular visitor to China, and you're also in frequent contact with Chinese counterparts. How has the mood on the ground changed since Donald Trump was elected?
The mood hasn't really changed much because Beijing has been convicted, I think, since 18 months ago that Trump is going to return to the White House. But what has really caught Beijing off guard is how rapidly the speed that Trump has unraveling the previous Biden administration's foreign policy and try to do something new. I think up until this stage, Beijing remained unclear what exactly Trump want to achieve under the China policy. So the mood in Beijing for now is almost like a wait-and-see game. That is what they're doing. Because obviously Beijing understand that Trump has taken unpredictability as a virtue, not as vice. So in return, what Beijing offer is that sense of stability, cold, and aloofness towards the responses on Donald Trump. And that's where we are, the overall mood.
And people often think of the Chinese Communist Party as a black box. It's hard to get information out to understand what's going on, what the leader Xi Jinping is thinking. But one of the ways that we can get some clues is through Chinese state and party media, which is how the Chinese regime communicates to its own officials and people. So what is the Chinese state-owned media saying about President Trump and the US right now? And what does that tell us about what senior leaders are thinking?
Well, interesting enough, I think the Chinese state media refrained from directly criticizing President Trump himself, but instead relentlessly attacking on the various so-called anti-China hawks around Donald Trump and sing the praise of people like Elon Musk. So it's a quite divided media space these days within China. I think also overall, if you're really judging from words from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi during his recent press conference 2 weeks ago, and he obviously criticized the United States, the policy that towards China being unstable, being antagonizing, but on the other hand, also leave some room for negotiation by calling that United States and China should peacefully coexist with each other, and that would be the ultimate endgame to Beijing's end.
And President Trump hasn't actually said much about China so far. A lot of his foreign policy energy has been directed towards the war in Ukraine, reaching out to President Putin in Russia. Do you think China has been surprised by Trump's outreach to Putin, and how much does it worry them given their own, so-called no-limits partnership?
Of course, really judging from the recent meeting that Xi Jinping had with the Russian #1 intelligence officer, Shoigu, I mean, there's a certain sense of uneasiness judging from the readout, because China suggested that all the parties that involving Russia's invasion towards Ukraine should be involved on the peace brokering process, whereas basically imply against Russia, United States, and seal the deal by themselves. So that is a sense of implication that somehow Beijing felt quite uneasy on this rapid rapprochement between the Kremlin and the White House. But I think on the other hand, Beijing also remained quite reticent because they're waiting to see how Europe is going to respond on this rapprochement. I think until the four involved parties, Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and United States, all very clear on the position, Beijing won't make any move. So again, taking a wait-and-see approach in this regard.
And in terms of China's own outreach to President Trump, how is the regime, how is the party thinking about this? Who are the people they want to reach out to in the Trump administration? And on the Chinese side, how does it want to try and influence the Trump administration?
Well, obviously, this will be very different from back to 8 years ago, because 8 years ago, the chief interlocutor from Beijing's end is the then Vice Premier Liu He, who is the chief trade negotiator on the trade war. However, given the overall U.S.-China relations turning so bad, and trade issues is only one of the thorny issues among others, having strong implications on U.S.-China relations. So it's not necessarily the trade negotiator that will be the interlocutor. Really, for me, for this time, it seems to be someone quite high up in the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party that cover security and the foreign policy issue, that will take the lead on U.S.-China relations, and also paired together with the current Vice Premier, He Lifeng, who will deal with the economic and financial issues altogether. So I think, again, it's remained quite unclear from Beijing's end, even though they have sent the former Chinese ambassador Cui Tiankai to the United States numerous times ever since Trump came into power. But it doesn't seem to achieve any desired result at this end, because also United States felt that if you're only sending a formal ambassador without sending some substantive heavy political heavyweight to Washington, and how Trump would be able to give any credibility on Beijing's intention in terms of improving bilateral relations.
Do you think Xi Jinping, do you think the Chinese leadership trust Trump? Do you think they see this as an opportunity to do a deal? Because you have to imagine this is probably the best chance China will have for a long time.
Most certainly, I think both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin would like to see a Yalta 2.0. And however China is willing to jump on that boat, we don't know for now. Even though that Donald Trump has shown some affection towards Xi Jinping, but really the responses from Xi Jinping's end seems to be that sense of cold, functional words come from Beijing authority, basically by saying, fine, I'm happy to have a working relationship, irrespective of who is sitting at Oval Office at the White House. And that is China's game. So this personal affection, when it comes to the Chinese leaders, I think it's very hard to translate from the affection towards the actual policy. So even though no matter Trump how much he'll demand a strong man ruling, but really on Xi Jinping, I think he's going to fail to communicate.
And what about in terms of how Xi Jinping sees Trump?
The sense of unpredictability that really strikes Xi Jinping. But on the other hand, I think his overall pursuit on this broadened vision of national security, that is to say that China needs to pursue technology self-reliance, economic, increasing internal consumption on the economy, that is all part of Xi Jinping's responses to Donald Trump. And how he sees him. He sees him as someone who he can talk to, but how much really he's willing to make a deal. And I think there's much of the trust deficit between the two people.
And just finally on this diplomacy question, how is China positioning itself with the rest of the world, particularly with developing countries, with the global south? Is this an opportunity for China to burnish its ties?
Well, in the conventional wisdom, that naturally, I think the rest of the world would strongly believe that China is interested and have the capability to fill the vacuum left by United States towards, in terms of developing relationship with the global south through economic assistance and foreign direct investment. However, I think the reality it is that China will offer very warm words in the various multilateral organizations, in the various multilateral fora. But when it comes to actually making the real substantive contribution, I think China will have to weigh in how much this substantive contribution will yielding sufficient return on investment for its domestic economy. I think that is the precondition for Beijing to be able to engage further anything towards the global south.
Thanks, Yu Jie. I want to pivot now to talk about security with William Matthews, who's a senior research fellow working on Chinese security and technology. So, William, let's kick off with an easy one, Taiwan. China's been ratcheting up the military and diplomatic pressure on Taiwan, which is a de facto independent state, but claimed by Beijing as its territory. President Joseph Biden had vowed to defend Taiwan if it was attacked by China. How far does Taiwan matter to Donald Trump, do you think?
I think the big problem here is actually we don't really know how much Taiwan actually matters to Trump, but I think a lot of the signals point to Trump actually himself not caring particularly about Taiwanese independence or protecting Taiwan as an end in itself. He clearly has an interest in Taiwan as a player in the semiconductor supply chain, semiconductor industry, but again, TSMC, the major Taiwanese semiconductor corporation, their pledge of investments in the USA, that might offset some of Trump's more pragmatic interest in protecting Taiwan. That said, the Trump administration contains a number of more traditional China hawks with a security focus who have in the past been very supportive of Taiwan. Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz being good examples, but I think the question is whether they actually have much impact on the direction of the Trump administration's policy in the longer term.
We recently met a Taiwanese counterpart who said that Taiwan's strategy for managing Trump was like giving sweets to a kid, just keep handing them out to distract him. And we know that TSMC, this huge Taiwanese semiconductor company you mentioned, has said it's going to invest more in the US. I mean, do you think that approach will work? Or do you think the more you give Trump, the more he'll sense weakness and he'll tighten up his own ratchet of pressure?
I mean, I think it will work in terms of improving the bilateral relationships between Taiwan and the United States. I'm skeptical as to how far it would actually work for really getting a serious commitment from the Trump administration. That said, the Trump administration has, they have sent mixed signals. The State Department dropped the language, for example, opposing Taiwanese independence, and the recent G7 statement has also sort of failed to mention the, upholding a one China policy. But again, those are questions of rhetoric, and what really matters here is substance, and I think that, at the moment, a substantive defence commitment Taiwan is lacking.
Given Trump's lack of interest and commitment towards Taiwan, is this an opportunity for Beijing to make a big move, either with military pressure, with other kinds of pressure, or do you think we're more likely just to see a continuation of this incremental increase of pressures on Taiwan that we've seen in the last 5-10 years?
Two things to say about that. One about, does it present an opportunity? In theory, yes. But again, I think the ambiguity of the Trump administration's stance means that if Beijing wanted to actually try and seize Taiwan within the next 4 years, they would be taking a gamble there. I don't think they would be comfortable in assuming yet that the US wouldn't come to Taiwan's assistance. That said, they are continuing to amp up pressure. You've got sort of some major exercises of military activity just going on in the last few days in response to the US, as well as alleging the Taiwanese president's crackdown on Chinese infiltration into Taiwan. But I think that's what they will prefer to stick to, basically using incidents like that to up the pressure through grey zone tactics. So that is things like joint exercises between the PLA Navy, the PLA Air Force, the Chinese Coast Guard, and so on. And ultimately, if over the next 4 years that is not met with a serious effort by the US to push back or to support Taiwan in pushing back, I think then you really are going to see the closing of Washington's window of opportunity to really be able to play a substantial role in maintaining Taiwanese independence, because you'll have essentially by the end of that continuous military presence of the PLA more or less around Taiwan, making any kind of intervention or de-escalation very difficult.
How far do you think China wants to fill the security gaps that might be left by the US?
I don't think actually that China has either the ambition currently to play an international security role on the level of the United States. It also doesn't have the capability. Even though the Chinese military has been modernizing very rapidly and so on, it still falls far short of the international power projection capability that the US has had, and the ability to establish and maintain bases around the world and so on. However, that said, a serious US retreat from global security would leave China sort of by default as one of the major players, with a growing presence, particularly around the Indian Ocean, for example, and obviously in the South China Sea, and also mean that actually China, the retreat of the US as a sort of hegemonic security presence will inherently make the security situation across much of the world more unstable. That, combined with China's increasing economic interests abroad, is going to mean, I think, that the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, does have to move from being a sort of vague set of concepts in a white paper to actually a more substantive security presence for China around the world to defend its economic interests.
And taking one very prominent practical example, if there is some sort of peace deal in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia and other parties, could you see any role for Chinese troops on the ground, either in Ukraine or in Russia or on the other side of the border?
I think that the only sort of realistic possibility of that is if you end up with actually a UN peacekeeping presence. China's been a sort of committed provider of UN peacekeeping forces, but then the likelihood of that really is contingent, I think, on Russia's position on a peace deal, and that's probably quite unlikely. China would take a big risk, I think, if it wanted to put troops on the ground in Europe, especially as it's trying to repair ties with Europe. It would put it in a very difficult position vis-a-vis both the relationship with Europe and the relationship with Russia. That said, China is, I think, likely to be very keen to play a key role in Ukrainian economic reconstruction after the war. And then I think you will have the question of, does that need by necessity to be accompanied by a Chinese security presence in terms of Chinese private security companies protecting reconstruction efforts and so on. So if there is a presence, it's likely to be through that rather than a sort of an official military peacekeeping role.
How far do you think the technology and trade restrictions that have been put in place over the last few years are going to limit the ability of the PLA, the Chinese military, to keep on growing its power and capabilities and its ability to project around the world?
Honestly, they're not going to have a lot of effect. I mean, we've already seen the effects of some of those restrictions are in part responsible for things like the success of DeepSeek, China's AI model. You know, what these restrictions end up doing is forcing innovation in new areas. The big problem the US faces, ultimately, is that China has far greater manufacturing capacity, 200 times the shipbuilding capacity, famously, and is now a close-to-peer competitor in a lot of emerging technologies. And, you now even have US defense analysts talking quite openly about the possibility that China will be able to deploy a sixth-generation combat jet before the United States does. And backed up with manufacturing capacity is likely to be able to do that at scale, even if that doesn't mean that China displaces the US as a global military power, which I think is unlikely and not really in Beijing's current ambitions. You're likely to see, I think, more and more movement to parity in terms of capability, and certainly a shift in China's favour in East Asia in terms of the balance of power.
And beyond the security and military sphere, do you think that will accelerate this sort of decoupling between the US and China, and even globally, where you might end up with one group of countries allied to the US with their own sort of different manufacturing systems and AI and technology, and China and perhaps most of the rest of the world kind of operating on a completely different model?
I think that's a significant risk, and that's a risk I think that a lot of US allies should take seriously, particularly when it comes to things like AI, for example. A lot of the success of that is due to access to data. Now, what China can do by deploying cheap AI across the global south through things like DeepSeek, through their existing digital infrastructure projects like Huawei, that not only gains influence and sort of by default promotes Chinese technology across much of the world, it also gives a huge amount of access to more data, which going forward could prove an advantage in terms of developing more and more advanced models.
Thanks so much, William. Finally, we want to go a bit deeper into this question about economic decoupling between the US and China. And our final guest is David Lubin, who's a senior research fellow in our Global Economy and Finance program. David, I believe China's the only country that Donald Trump has actually put targeted tariffs on so far. He's threatened Canada and Mexico, but given both a reprieve. There's been a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium. That applies to all countries. Why is China the only country that he's taken action against so far?
In pure economic terms, China has the biggest bilateral trade surplus with the United States, and so China is the biggest target in that sense. But more broadly than that, China is the most credible, obvious threat to US primacy. And so taking down the Chinese economy or limiting China's capacity to expand its role in the world is the central foreign policy objective of the Trump administration. And for that reason, it makes absolute sense that so far China is the only country to have attracted, as you say, an aggregate of 20% increase in the average tariff. And it's quite possible that more will come after the trade investigations related to the 1962 Trade Expansion Act and the 1974 Trade Act, all of those trade investigations that are supposed to be concluded on the 1st of April. Once those are done and the Trump administration has access to other kinds of legal basis on which to impose more punitive tariffs and sanctions on the Chinese economy, I'm sure during the course of April we'll see more news flow on this.
And while there are many things we don't know about Trump, two things we do know is that he really doesn't like trade deficits and he really loves tariffs. Why?
the tariffs is maybe a bit more easier to explain than the trade deficits. I mean, I think he just believes that trade deficits are a source of national emasculation. And while that is possibly true for a country that doesn't print the world's reserve currency, it's much more difficult to see the economic logic of that argument for the United States that does print the world's reserve currency. Now, you may think that he's got a point in thinking that over some long term, the more the US increases its net liability position vis-a-vis the rest of the world, in other words, the more dollars there are out there, there is, the risk that the US will end up undermining the dollar's reserve currency status. But I think responding to that very, very long-term risk with the much more immediate obsession with reducing trade deficits is difficult to square. The fondness for tariffs is also a difficult one to rationalize economically, but he just believes that it's an effective way of reducing the trade deficit. One must make a distinction between the use of tariffs in reducing a bilateral trade deficit and the use of tariffs in reducing an overall trade deficit. It's reasonable to believe that the United States can reduce the bilateral deficit with China by increasing tariffs. But as we saw after 2018, all that does is that it just like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, it sort of pushes the source of the trade deficit somewhere else. China's exports to the United States fell sharply after 2018, but the US imports from Vietnam, from Mexico, from South Korea, from Taiwan replaced those imports. So in aggregate terms, tariffs haven't done anything to reduce the deficit, but in bilateral terms, they have.
The Chinese leadership, they must have seen these tariffs coming a mile off. Are they concerned, or have they already planned for this?
Well, there's been, a number of different responses of the Chinese authorities. The first round of tariffs attracted Chinese tariffs on U.S. imports of U.S. coal, of liquefied natural gas, of crude oil, investigations of Google. We subsequently had tariffs announced by the Chinese authorities on imports of U.S. soybeans and sorghum and cotton. The Chinese authorities have expanded the unreliable entity list and have announced some export controls. So China has not been passive in response to the imposition of U.S. tariffs. But I would say that in any bilateral trade conflict, when you try and sort of answer the question, who's going to win? I think there are three conditions that matter here. One is to be big. Two is to be closed, in other words, not trade dependent. And three is to be the deficit country, because by being the deficit country, arithmetically, you can impose a lot more tariffs on your trading partner than they can impose on you. And so from that point of view, the US is big, closed, and the deficit country. And so in some narrow sense, China has got a lot more to lose economically from this trade conflict than the United States does.
So in that sense, is Trump pursuing a good policy? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is he's doing the right thing to make America strong and undermine China. This sounds like great economics.
It depends whether you're focusing on absolute or relative gains. I think, for Donald Trump, my personal view is that for Donald Trump, power is a relative game. And so if global welfare goes down as a result of what one might consider nutty economic policy, from Trump's point of view, that might be okay, as long as in relative terms, the United States is better off than anybody else.
And what about from the Chinese perspective? I mean, are they worried about a relative loss of power, or are they worried about the direct impact of these tariffs on jobs and their economy, which, as I said earlier, is already in a pretty weak position? It's never really recovered after COVID.
It's very difficult to work out what they're worried about, because I think over the last year or so, and maybe more than a year, the big puzzle in thinking about Chinese economic policy is to work out why they've spent so much more effort in talking about delivering support to the economy than they've put into actually delivering the support. Their talk is much greater than their walk, and that's been consistently true. I mean, it was April 2024 when the Politburo meeting that month first indicated that the authorities really were becoming quite anxious about the depressed state of confidence in the corporate sector and in the household sector. And in the months after that, there was a sort of drip feed of announcements that there was an intention to deliver more support for the economy. And some effort was given, was applied in the fourth quarter of last year in reducing mortgage rates, easing down payment requirements for property purchases, easing purchase restrictions in various Chinese cities. So there was an effort to support the real estate market. There was the introduction of trade-in programs to support the purchase of household appliances. But all of the indications late 2024, even into the Central Economic Works Conference that took place in December last year, all the indications were that, don't worry, when the National People's Congress takes place in March 2025, everything will be sorted out. And so they were, I think, allowing expectations to build up that the two meetings that took place a couple of weeks ago would be the moment when more decisive stimulus was delivered. And that actually just didn't happen. The budget deficit was increased from 3% of GDP in 2024 to 4% of GDP in 2025. I mean, that's a very narrow assessment of what the overall budget is, but let's leave it at that. And some other measures were announced, but the bulk of the increase in the deficit, the bulk of the increase in special purpose government bonds, both at the central and local government levels, have not really been, the proceeds of those bonds are not designed to support households. They're designed to support production. And that, I think, is a consistent theme in Chinese policy response to economic downturn. Their aim is to support production rather than consumption. And I think that, in turn, reflects the idea that economic policy in China is kind of captured by the geopolitical environment in which China finds itself. If you think that you're threatened geopolitically, the last thing you're going to do is give households a bunch of handouts to make them feel good about life. You've got to orient economic policy around supporting tech and manufacturing and ensuring that your economy is protected against the risk of sanctions and other sorts of economic assault. And so that, I think in a way, one of the ways I often, describe this is that there's a distinction to be made between the welfare of Chinese households and the welfare of the Chinese nation. And I think Xi Jinping is focused on the latter, not the former. And indeed, Chinese households, to some extent, are under some obligation to step up to the plate and sort of meet the moment in which the Chinese nation is, facing a considerable threat from Washington.
So do you think the strategy of focusing on self-reliance in manufacturing technology, dampening public expectations in some ways and putting security first and integrating more, as Yu Jie was saying earlier, with markets in the global south, do you think that can be a winning long-term strategy for China?
It can be, although I think the redirection of Chinese exports away from the United States and towards developing countries in the last few years has created something of a kind of paradox for China. On the one hand, it looks like the Trump administration is delivering a gift to Beijing to allow Beijing to strengthen its links with other developing countries. And yet the evidence is not quite so straightforward, because one of the consequences of this increase in Chinese exports to the developing world is that, China's trade surplus with the developing world as a whole is now very, very large. 2023 was the first year in which 1/2 of China's overall trade surplus was a surplus with other developing countries. Now, some countries are relaxed about that. It gives them access to, cheap solar panels and cheap lithium batteries and stuff like that. But what you also see is evidence of growing discomfort on the part of bits of the developing world with the increased absorption of Chinese stuff. And the evidence for that is that when you look at hostile trade policies directed at Beijing, the fastest growing source of hostile trade policy directed at Beijing is coming from the developing world. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers on Chinese imports. So I think the evidence is mixed. I think, it's broadly speaking right to assume that these days China's links with the developing world are much more easy to strengthen, given the behavior of the Trump administration. But it's not a straightforward path.
And just finally, you said that the Chinese leadership sees the wealth of the nation as much more important than the wealth of individual consumers.
The welfare of the nation.
Okay, the welfare of the nation. How about for the United States? Because it seems to me that if the US is going to win this multi-generational economic conflict with China, they're going to have to do something similar. They're going to have to punish their own consumers with much higher prices if they want to onshore all this production and manufacturing. So do you think US consumers are willing to pay the price necessary to win this long-term strategic battle with China?
That's a very interesting question. When J.D. Vance was a senator, there was a question that he put to Jerome Powell, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, in a Senate hearing, where he said to Powell, Chairman Powell, don't you think that the reserve status of the U.S. dollar just facilitates U.S. consumers buying a bunch of, quote, mostly useless imports? And I think from within the administration, there is this sense of a desire to engage in some social engineering, if you like, to wean US consumers off of this dependence on stuff coming in from China. How successful that will be, I don't know if Trump himself thinks this, but certainly people around Trump have this sense that there needs to be some fundamental change in US behavior, in US consumption activities to kind of, step up to the plate and meet this geopolitical challenge.
I have one final question to you all. So in just one sentence, tell me one thing that you think we should be watching right now to understand the future trajectory of US-China relations. And we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with you first, David.
I think the Chinese exchange rate kind of got this sort of binary quality at the moment. Either the renminbi will depreciate considerably in an effort to offset the impact of Trump's tariffs, or, as some people are discussing, the possibility that China might agree to strengthen the renminbi as a way of allowing the US to reduce its trade deficit with China. Now, there are plenty of reasons why the Chinese will viscerally oppose an appreciation of the renminbi. The most obvious is that if the renminbi strengthens in nominal terms, that would, other things equal, tip the Chinese economy fully into deflation. And moreover, many Chinese economists, many Chinese policymakers believe that the nail in the coffin of the Japanese economy in the 1980s was Tokyo's signature on the Plaza Accord that revalued the yen. So there are many reasons why the Chinese will resist an appreciation of the renminbi, but there might be a price for everything. And the question is, what might Washington put on the table to encourage Beijing to consider an appreciation of the exchange rate? So the direction of the exchange rate is my sort of main interesting uncertainty, if you like.
Well, it wasn't a sentence, but it was an interesting answer, so I'll let you get away. I'll let you get away with it. William.
I think the key thing to watch long term is how successful the Trump administration's efforts to rebuild America's industrial base are going to be, and how far they can also start to implement some of these emerging technologies across it to offset China's advantage.
Great. And Yu Jie, the last word.
Well, the short term is, let's pick up the signpost whether Beijing is going to remove the sanction imposed towards this current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And if Beijing decides to do so, and that means the bilateral relations might have some sufficient room for improvement.
Thanks so much to Yu Jie, to William Matthews and to David Lubin, and thank you to all our listeners as well. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Ben Bland. Thank you for listening and goodbye.